Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog.
Good evening. I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to tonight's Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Our guest tonight is Naomi Oreskes, co-author of the very popular Merchants of Doubt and more recently, The Collapse of Western Civilization. Dr. Oreskes is professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. Dr. Oreskes received her PhD in geological research and the history of science at Stanford in 1990. Her research since has focused on earth and environmental sciences, geophysics, and the history of science, especially on scientific consensus and dissent. Before joining the Harvard faculty in 2013, Dr. Oreskes was professor of history and science studies for 15 years at the University of California, San Diego, and adjunct professor of geosciences at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. In addition, she has served as a consultant for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, among other organizations. She's a member of the History of Science Society and numerous other professional societies and editorial boards, and she's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The numerous awards she has received include the History of Science Society's Watson Davis Prize and Caltech's Francis Bacon Medal for Outstanding Scholarship in the History of Science. In addition to her two very popular books with Eric Conway, Merchants of Doubt and The Collapse of Western Civilization, Dr. Oreskes has co-edited an award-winning book on plate tectonics, and she's authored several other technical books as well as many articles and reports. By the way, the film version of Merchants of Doubt will be released March 6th this coming year. 2015. We'll post that information on the Science for the Public website. We are very honored to welcome Naomi Oreskes. Welcome, Dr. Oreskes.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
And if you will please start us with the topic of Merchants of Doubt, which I hope everybody will read. It is very readable and very informative, with the examples of misinformation deliberately put out to confuse the public. So some of those examples.
Merchants of Doubt tells the story of a group of men who I think of as serial contrarians or serial climate change or science deniers. What we discovered in our research was that there were a whole set of scientific issues, of which climate change is only the most recent, in which people had challenged the scientific evidence. And what we discovered was that there was a pattern, that the challenge took the same form in every case. We don't really know, the science is unsettled, there's no consensus, the uncertainties are very great, and therefore it would be wrong and premature to do anything about it. That basic strategy, that set of claims, we found had been used not just to challenge the scientific evidence of climate change, but also the scientific evidence of the ozone hole, of the reality of acid rain, of the harms of the indiscriminate use of pesticides, particularly DDT, and most tellingly, the scientific evidence of the harms of tobacco use. And what we also found was not only was the strategy used the same in all of those cases, but the people involved were the same too. And so when we made that discovery, we realized this is not a scientific debate, this is some other kind of activity that needs to be researched and understood and talked about.
Right. And I would like to underscore it's still around.
And it's
We're
still going
seeing
on.
it all the time. I'm interested in see how this will spell out now that they have e-cigarettes to replace the old cigarettes. And I have just recently heard an ad for one, and I'm waiting to hear. We will hear, I am sure, these are harmless and everything is okay. Just exactly the sort of campaign that you have discussed. So in terms of the structure, you've said, what the kinds of things that these people do. Then in terms of structuring, like the research, so to speak, for that, how is that done?
Well, there's a couple of key things that are important to understand. The first one is that the people involved don't have to say that e-cigarettes are safe. It's actually a more subtle strategy than that. It's to say we don't really know.
Of course.
It's to use uncertainty. So it's to take normal scientific uncertainty, because after all science is uncertain. Nothing in science is ever absolutely, positively proven beyond any possible doubt. It's demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt. But the idea is then to take the reality of uncertainty and to use it against science and to say, well, because it's not absolutely, positively, 100% certain, therefore we don't know anything, and therefore who are you to say that e-cigarettes should be regulated? That's the move. And it's a very nefarious move, because scientists can't say, oh, we know everything there is to know about this issue. Scientists are always, in a way, backed into a corner where they say, well, yes, of course, there is in fact a lot of uncertainty, but, and the next thing you know, scientists are in a defensive position.
Yes.
So it's all about putting science on the defensive. And once you're on the defensive, chances are you've actually already lost the debate. So scientists, in a sense, have lost from the very beginning. Once the debate is framed as a debate about uncertainty, scientists almost always lose, or at least they lose initially. And so this is the strategy that we see. And it's really not about doing research. The organizations and the people involved almost never do their own actual original scientific research. They don't do research, they don't publish in peer-reviewed journals. What they do is to attack, question, raise doubts about mainstream, normal, legitimate scientific research. The other part of the strategy that's really important to understand is what we call Potemkin village science. One of the ways that they challenge real science, and by that I mean science done by scientists in universities and research institutes, is that they will write reports which they dress up like science. They create covers that look scientific. They have footnotes. They have references. So they have all the trappings, all the paraphernalia of science, except it isn't actually scientific research. It's not done by scientists. It's not peer-reviewed. And most important, it's not actually subject to kind of scientific spirit, where whatever the results are, you say, well, okay, that's what the results are. Rather, it's based on knowing in advance what result you want and then cherry-picking the data to give you the result you want. And this is very difficult for journalists and the public to sort out, because if you see a report comes across your desk that looks scientific, it's got footnotes, it's got, and you look and say, wow, this report seems very convincing, it has charts, it has graphs, it has maps. How do you know that it's actually Potemkin village science? How do you know that it's actually fake? Well, the answer is in most cases you don't know, and that's how people get sucked into this disinformation.
Right. Now, in your book, you talk about real scientists, though, and some of them very prestigious names, certainly. You talked about the post-Cold War period, and I think now there's a lot of interest what happened in this shift. Could you go into that a little bit, and why were these famous people enlisted so easily?
Right. So the key part of the strategy involves recruiting scientists, and this is a key idea that the tobacco industry pioneered more than half a century ago. And the reason is because the doubt-mongering strategy doesn't really work if you don't have scientists involved. Because if a tobacco industry executive were to sit here across the table from you and say, well, we're not persuaded that tobacco is harmful, you'd roll your eyes and you'd say, well, of course he's saying that. He's a tobacco industry executive. But if a scientist says it, and particularly a prominent scientist, and especially a former president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, that's a whole different matter. So the tobacco industry early on developed this strategy of recruiting scientists. Now, the reality was they couldn't really recruit oncologists or epidemiologists, because most of those people realized that the scientific evidence was clear, but they were able to recruit other scientists who were not actually experts in tobacco, not actually experts in cancer and oncology, but who, for whatever reason, were prepared to make common cause with the industry. And so what we tell in the book, Emergence of Doubt, we tell the story of a group of scientists who undertook these activities. They're physicists,
Yes.
and they have a very particular personal history. They're all Cold War physicists.
Yes.
They're all men who rose to positions of quite high influence and power in American science policy circles by virtue of the work they had done in the Cold War on American weapons and rocketry programs. So they're powerfully influential. They have access to the halls of power. They know generals and admirals and senators, and in some cases even the President of the United States. And they also know how to speak to the media because they have a long history of doing that as well. So they're very politically savvy. They're very, very intelligent. And they're very distinguished people. But there's just this one weird piece of the story, which is that they start attacking the scientific work of their colleagues. And so when we were writing this book and we were thinking about how to write this as a story that would be interesting to people and not just a dry academic book that you would have to, you know, take stimulants to read, we thought, well, in a way, this is a mystery. Because why would distinguished, prominent scientists do this? Why would a former president of the National Academy of Sciences go to work for the tobacco industry? And so that was the question we set out to answer. And the answer to the question really had to do with the politics of the Cold War, and particularly the politics of the late Cold War. So you might think that when the United States wins the Cold War and the Soviet Union falls apart, that these men would have been happy. You might think that they would declare victory and pop champagne corks, but they don't. Instead, they look for a new enemy. They're like generals who can't stop fighting the last war, and the new enemy for them are the Reds under the bed. And those, you know, the internal threat. And those Reds under the bed, in their view, are environmentalists, who they call watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside, because they think that environmentalism is a kind of backdoor to socialism through the mechanism of encroaching government regulation of the marketplace. So it's a kind of slippery slope argument. First, today we control tobacco. We say, okay, no tobacco smoking in public places. Then we start to regulate it. Maybe then we ban it. And today it's tobacco, but tomorrow, who knows what the government will control.
And we're hearing that a lot right now from the right-wing centers, and as put out as an offense against American liberty of all sorts of things. Can you give us any other examples, like from the ozone hole, all these the several things that you addressed in there? It's the same thing every time. If we get regulations, the world will come to an end. Can you tell us, give us some other examples about that?
Well, it's every example in the book. I mean, this is the pattern. So this is the reason that we realized there was a book to write was the pattern, right? Originally we thought we might write a book just about climate change and who these people were and why they were denying the scientific evidence. But then when we realized they had done all this other stuff as well, we realized, oh no, the story is the pattern. Because it's the same every single time.
True.
Why do you deny the reality of the ozone hole? Well, because if the ozone hole is real, we have to regulate the chemicals that cause it. Why would you deny the reality of acid rain, even though you can see the damage in forests? Well, because if acid rain is real, you've got to regulate the electrical utilities that are creating the sulfur emissions that cause acid rain. Why would you defend tobacco? Well, because if tobacco kills people, you might regulate tobacco use. So therefore, that's a government intervention in the marketplace. Why would you deny the evidence of climate change? Because that's the mother of all environmental problems. Because if climate change is real, it means everything we do, every time from the minute we wake up in the morning and turn off our alarm clock and turn on the lights till we go to bed at night, we use energy in everything we do. We're using energy right now. So if the use of energy by burning fossil fuels is creating greenhouse gases that are driving climate change, that means that the government has got to regulate energy. And that's the implication that these people refuse to accept. Now, you could say, and Eric Conway and I do say, well, we could have a rational discussion about that. We could say, right, good point. So how do we manage this problem? How do we solve this problem without tyrannical government intervention in our personal lives, because neither Eric
Which no other country has a problem with.
Well, right, but I mean, contrary to what some people say about me on the internet, I'm not a Stalinist. In fact, I do not want the government intervening in my private life. So we could have a rational conversation about that. And the irony of the story, to me, the most ironic chapter in the book actually is the chapter about acid rain, because in the context of acid rain, Republican advisors to President George H.W. Bush, our first President Bush, came up with a market-based mechanism to solve the problem of acid rain, and it was emissions trading. Many people have forgotten, including Republicans, that emissions trading was a Republican idea.
Right.
And the fact is, it worked. We have a market-based mechanism that is demonstrated to work. So there are ways to solve these problems without becoming communists. But somehow that argument got lost in the shuffle, and instead it became that this is a threat to liberty, this is a threat to personal freedom, this is a threat to the American way of life. And we cannot tolerate that threat, so what we do is we challenge the science.
Right. There are a couple of things. Before you leave that, you mentioned, if I recall, a couple of times where government agencies obscured data or something. I remember once was around the SST emissions, and I'm trying to think what the other one was, but it was amazing that government agencies charged with responsibility also messed with things.
Well, the focus of the book isn't on government agencies, because that's, of course, a different and complicated problem. But one of the things we do know that throughout this story, there's been tremendous amounts of pressure put on the government agencies.
That, right.
And we certainly have seen evidence of agencies like the EPA pulling their punches on some issues.
Recently, yes.
But that's not really our primary focus. And actually, the most egregious examples we have in the book are not about government agencies.
Yes.
I mean, so in this story about acid rain, one of the things we show is that actually the government agencies like the EPA were completely ready to act on the science. And in fact, the United States under President Carter had negotiated a draft bilateral agreement with the Canadian government that had the support of EPA, NOAA, all of the major relevant agencies that had an interest in the issue. The Reagan administration came to power and essentially made a decision to scuttle that treaty. But one of the ways they did was to try to claim that the science was uncertain. So they commissioned a new report under the direction of Bill Nierenberg, who's one of the people we talk about in the book. And one of the most egregious things that we found, and the documentary evidence on this is completely clear, and it's footnoted. Anyone who wants to go to the archives and look at this can find it in the Nierenberg papers at Scripps, you know, unless some climate denier goes in and you know, burns those papers, was that under direction from the Reagan administration, Bill Nierenberg wrote a report that said we didn't really know about many of the details of the acid rain, even though there were already multiple reports from the National Academy of Sciences, EPA, elsewhere that said that we did. And not only that, we know, because there's a paper trail that shows it, that a report was written that the scientists involved had signed off on that said that actually it is a problem. And Bill Nierenberg, under direct direction from George Keyworth, who was the president's science advisor, and we found the memo that shows it, changed the report after the scientists involved in it had signed off on it. So a kind of, you know, straight up corruption of scientific peer review. And the scientists involved, when they found out, complained about it. We have that evidence as well, but it was too late. The damage had been done because the critical congressional vote had already been taken, and members of Congress said after the fact that that report had been influential in their decision to vote against this bilateral treaty with Canada. So we have the evidence that it was done, we have the evidence of who did it, how they did it, why they did it, and that it made it that it had an impact, a negative.
And it's impressive. You have you've presented so much data, and so there it is. If anybody wants to look, there, it's not like some vague conspiracy kind of thing.
No, and it's funny because, you know, of course, many people buy a book but don't necessarily read it all, which is totally fine. But many people I know haven't actually read the acid rain chapter because they think of it as sort of like old history. And I know there are people who have picked up the book and just read the climate change bits. But honestly, if you have time to only read one chapter of this book,
you would go for that.
I would say the acid rain chapter because it's the one that's the clearest and most absolutely blatant example. And it was interesting. It was actually the last chapter we finished because I had found such frankly shocking materials and how to make sense of it and how to write about it in a calm way. You was a little bit of a challenge. And so the rest of the book was finished, and I was still finishing the chapter on acid rain. And Eric was calling me saying, Naomi, you need to stop. You need to finish this. This book needs to be done.
This is an unending story, yes.
Correct.
And it's still, a lot of these problems are very much with us, even though a lot of, the early signals, presidents got on board, beginning with Johnson, saying we have all these problems, but it has just taken these years, and it seemed like it really got off the tracks beginning in the 80s with the Reagan administration, and then those people carried through. On this, you mentioned a lot of these very right-wing organizations. How does that work, and how do they fund this sort of thing and put out the word so effectively?
Mm-hmm. So a key part of the strategy involves think tanks.
Yes.
And so this, in the story, one of the crucial or central parts of the story is that Bill Nierenberg, together with Fred Seitz,
yes.
the former president of the National
yes.
Academy of Sciences, and fellow scientist Robert Jastrow, who had been
yeah.
the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, create a independent think tank, supposedly independent think tank, which becomes their base of operations. And it's called the George C. Marshall Institute.
Yes.
And that's a deliberate choice because it's meant to invoke the anti-communist role of the Marshall Plan in protecting Western Europe and rebuilding it after World War II. And they begin systematically, it's created in 1988, and by 1989 they issue their first report challenging the scientific evidence of global warming. So this is an old story that's more than 20 years old now. And they do it under the umbrella of this think tank. Now, who funds it? Well, it's a very interesting story because most people, when they hear about the book, they assume that this is a story of scientists who have been corrupted by money. And that's really not what it is. It's really about the ideology of the free market and the link between free market capitalism and American democracy. Jastrow, Seitz, Nierenberg, and a fourth scientist who they also worked with named Fred Singer, all essentially share a set of beliefs which they interpret as the defense of American democracy. So that's okay. I believe in American democracy too, right? The question is how they go about it and how they interpret it. And so they begin this campaign of challenging the scientific evidence, climate change, acid rain, the ozone hole. Those are the big three, but Seitz is still at that time working for the tobacco industry at the same time. So the think tank plays a crucial role because the think tank makes it look independent,
yes.
makes it look like it's not just a shill for the tobacco industry. And in some ways, initially it is. So one of the interesting documents we found early on was that Bob Jastrow wrote a letter to his colleagues in which he said, I don't think we should take money from industry because we do need to be independent. So he initially reaches out to conservative and libertarian foundations. Now, many of these foundations, of course, are funded by industry.
Well, yes.
So the Olin Foundation, SCAFE, Smith Richardson, some of these, Mellon, some of these are foundations whose original money comes out of oil and gas. So there are links to industry, but they're not direct. However, that strategy of independence doesn't last very long. And within a very short period of time, within a few years, by the mid-90s, we see them, in fact, taking money from the fossil fuel industry. And subsequently, the director of the Marshall Institute becomes Bill O'Keefe, who had previously worked API, the American Petroleum Institute, and also had been a lobbyist for ExxonMobil. This is something that...
You're talking about like a club.
Right, it's a kind of club.
Yeah.
And so the funding is coming indirectly through regulated industries. And so as this grows in the 1990s, then we see the development of a kind of network of think tanks in which the Marshall Institute is only one, the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, Frontiers of Freedom, the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, the Heartland Institute. And when you start searching, what you realize is the Acton Institute. One time I tried to make a slide with all of the ones that I could find. The font got so small you couldn't read it. Right? So there's now a network of these organizations that I would say probably more than 24 of them. And if you ask the question who funds them, well, it turns out to be difficult because many of these groups are funded in ways that make it actually hard to track the funding. But to the extent that we've been able to track it, definitely the fossil fuel industry, definitely the tobacco industry, interestingly enough, in recent years, the cell phone industry.
Yeah.
So what we're really looking at is either regulated industries or industries that are worried that they will be regulated.
Yes.
And that's the common theme.
Right.
It's this issue of
Right.
fighting regulation. And so what you see then is a kind of toxic blend, a kind of damaging and dangerous blend between a political ideology, which at least on some levels, is not necessarily entirely wrong, right? The defense of freedom is a good thing. But then making common cause with regulated industries who have tremendous financial stakes. And it's that mix of money and ideology that then becomes so tremendously powerful.
Right, and that it just happens to be poisoning the planet and everybody on it. So that's a small
right. But you have this
issue,
sort of
right,
ideological cover that makes it seem like
right.
it's not just about greed.
Yes.
And in fact, it isn't just about greed. It is about greed for the people who are funding it, but it is also about some authentic political conviction by others. And it's that mix, I think, of the authentic conviction and the financing that becomes so powerful.
Right. You know, these foundations and especially think tanks have a tremendous influence in the media as well. And consulting, and they do all sorts of things. So people may or may not be familiar with them, and I urge them to get acquainted with them in your book by all means. They are very active, these think tanks in particular. And so you run across them with key columnists in major newspapers and so on. Why isn't the media a little more savvy about this?
Well, this is a question that we got asked a lot when the book came out. And usually when journalists would ask me, I would say, "You're the journalist."
Yes,
you know,
right,
it was sort of a
right.
weird position to have journalists asking me.
Right.
So I think this is something that the journalistic community desperately needs to be talking about more. But I think the part of it that became clear to us as we were doing the work was that the journalists, in a sense, got taken in by the claim that think tanks are intellectually independent. So the idea of a think tank is a reasonable one. It's to think, right? To think about
Generate
problems,
papers.
generate ideas, policy
Right.
positions. And if these think tanks were truly independent, then hearing what they had to say on these issues could be legitimate. But what the journalistic community got suckered into was presenting think tanks that were largely funded by regulated industry as being sort of equivalent to scientists working on science. And they did this because of their own journalistic ideals of objectivity and balance. And they interpreted objectivity and balance as giving equal time to opposing views. So they took what was essentially a political model, and a model which, you know, we can argue about whether that's an effective model for political debate, but at least in a two-party system, there's at least some plausible argument for why you might give equal time to Democrats and Republicans. But now they transfer that model onto science, where it doesn't work at all, because the basic fact is that think tanks are not science. They're not scientists. They're not doing science. And so you see this spectacle, and you see it everywhere. And it's not just in, you know, places that we might consider to be conservative or right-leaning, like Fox News. You see it in the Washington Post. You see it in the New York Times, Newsweek, all the time. A scientist is being quoted talking about the scientific results that they've published in peer-reviewed journals or a report of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's juxtaposed against someone from the Cato Institute, often an economist, or someone who we don't even know who he is, right? As if that were somehow, you know, equivalent. So it's basically taking a model of political balance and imposing it on science, where the idea of balance actually has no place and makes no sense.
Yeah.
Now, the think tanks, particularly the tobacco industry, but others too, knew this, knew that journalists would do this. And so the whole strategy was deliberately based on the idea of pressuring journalists to give equal time for their views under the rubric of balance. And we found documents in which people in the tobacco industry or in tobacco industry front groups, like the so-called TASC, the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, and we can talk more about that. You know, deliberately saying, we'll put this out through TASC and be sure to hide the Philip Morris fingerprints.
Yes.
And that to me was so telling because, of course, again, if we were talking about tobacco, if a New York Times reporter was reporting on tobacco and it was obvious that this was coming from Philip Morris, they might say, okay, well,
yes.
But it gets channeled through a think tank. The journalist gets suckered into believing the think tank is independent, but they're not.
Right. I'd like to add to that. I hope that people are aware that this is something people complain about public radio, public television anymore. They are suddenly having to give equal, a balanced thing.
Right.
And as you say, you may have Mr. Scientist right here,
Right.
and then Cato Institute as a counterbalance
Right.
here, so that we are equal, giving equal time.
Right.
And people do notice it if they know the
If they're paying
issues,
attention.
but if they
Right, if you don't-
don't,
right.
your point about the media being sort of pushed into this,
Right.
but they still have a responsibility.
Correct, absolutely.
They really should.
And people,
Yeah.
it's a very tricky issue, because people sometimes say to me, well, don't you believe in balance? Don't you believe in fairness? Don't you
Yeah,
believe in objectivity?
right.
Of course, but again, we're talking about scientific evidence.
Yes.
The relevant criteria in science is accuracy
Yeah.
and evidence. If you present climate change as if it's a debate, you've actually presented an inaccurate,
Right.
a wrong, a false presentation of what the reality is. So no journalist would say in public that they want to present a false picture of what's going on in the scientific community, and yet that's exactly what they've done.
Yes, and they've gotten, from your view, they've sort of gotten pushed into it, but they should be a little more aware now than perhaps they are.
Right.
What is our situation compared, well, I should say, what are other countries like compared to us in this regard? Do Western European nations complain that their governments are subservient to these special interests like this too?
Well, let me unpack that question. The first part, it's completely different in Europe. I mean, for years I would go to Europe and I would feel like I had traveled into a parallel universe, because the whole phenomenon of climate change denial, or
especially that, yeah,
or any of these
yeah.
things, didn't really exist in Europe. And I think that has to do with the particular resonance of, well, two things. The particular resonance of the idea of balance in the American media, which is tied up with our notion of American democracy and free speech, but also the particular relevance of these arguments about democracy and freedom and personal liberty. Because in Europe, most people, by and large, accept that the economies of Europe are mixed economies, that there's a kind of mix of free market and regulated industries, some nationalized industries, less now than there was some years ago, but still, you have train systems in Germany that are essentially run by the government. You have universities in Europe are almost all, with a few exceptions, public institutions funded by the government. So this particular argument that government intervention in the marketplace leads you into tyranny doesn't have the same kind of cultural resonance as it does in the United States. The other thing that doesn't really work in Europe the way it does here, climate change deniers like to present themselves as lonely heroes, that Mr. Smith, I'm the only one who has the courage to stand up to the groupthink of the scientific community. Yeah. I'm the Galileo. I'm the Alfred Wegener. Right. Yeah. And because Americans have a cultural, what do we want to call it, kind of mythology about the role of the rugged individual, the cowboy, the individual who stands up against the mass and turns out to be right. I think, again, journalists particularly get really sucked into this idea of the lonely, heroic individual who's right when everyone else is wrong. That kind of story, that kind of narrative, just doesn't really work in, say, France, where there's much greater respect for, the scientific elites who have been educated in the écoles, for example.
And the government is more educated.
The government is more educated. The whole role of elite scientific expertise is very different there. So there's been no really significant climate change denial movement at all in continental Europe. There has been a bit in England, but interesting enough, in England, it's totally the same as here. It's tied up with free market ideology. It's tied up with
and under conservative governments.
Conservative governments, Thatcherism. In fact, in Europe, it's so tied up with the Tory Thatcherite deregulation neoliberal model that it's been an embarrassment to the climate change deniers in Europe that Margaret Thatcher actually was one of the first political leaders to say that climate change was really a problem. In fact, created the Tyndall Center for Climate Science in the United Kingdom. Absolutely. So Margaret Thatcher was a totally, you can agree or disagree with her neoliberal policies. She was totally wonderful on climate change. But now there's a kind of revisionist history where they have to deny that because it doesn't fit with the sort of Thatcherite neoliberal deregulatory model that is continues to be pushed by the Tories in Britain.
Yeah, but in general, they seem to be much more advanced in Europe, and as you say, they're not anti-regulation. In fact, they're hoping to get regulation since they're, they understand that they're going to be inundated pretty soon with the high seas.
They already have an emissions trading program in Europe. I mean, the European Union instituted emissions trading a number of years ago. The system didn't work properly because the permits, there were too many permits, they were too cheap, the price was too low. So now they're rejiggering the system. But we've already heard of, the EU has already made a new commitment to, I think it's a 27% reduction, I forgot what the baseline is.
And some countries are really moving ahead for climate change,
and actually
and they're doing well.
Right, most of the European countries have actually met their targets under Kyoto. Whereas the United States...
We haven't signed, have we?
Well, not only did we not sign, but if we had signed, we would have had to have cut our emissions. Relative to where we were at that time, our emissions have actually gone up 7%.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing. There's a lot of sleight of hand in this whole thing. So there will be people out there who are saying how we've reduced our emissions in the United States. And the way they do that is by a shifting baseline, by comparing it back to 2008, rather than back to 1997, which is when the original Kyoto agreements were supposed to be,
a bit tricky there.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of working fast and loose with the numbers. But the bottom line is that the European Union has moved much more, has taken the issue much more seriously and has moved to commit to binding emissions reductions, which we, of course, in the United States have not done.
Right. We are the real laggards, and I hope people understand that. We've really dragged our feet, and we're the number 2, I suppose.
Well, even that,
polluters,
this is one of the things that drives me, gets me most frustrated. There's so much misspeaking and loose speaking about this issue, even among people who, are not in denial about the issue. So now we hear a lot about China, and we hear constantly how China is now the #1 emitter in the world. Well, that's true if you're talking about annual emissions. It is true that just in the last couple of years, China has surpassed the United States in annual emissions. But if you look at historic emissions, the United States is still the top world historic emissions.
That's a very interesting
point.
And
it's not the annual emissions that drive climate change, it's the total emissions. So we should still be focused on the total emissions, and the United States is still the #1 total emitter on the planet. The other thing that gets left out of the conversation is per capita emissions.
Yes.
So it is true that annually China now has just surpassed the United States, but they also have, 3 times as many people, 3 to 4 times.
And they're working on it.
Well,
they're working on the problem.
Yeah, I mean, you could say we are too, sort of. But the bottom line is that our emissions are 3 to 4 times as high per capita as the Chinese. So, it's a much bigger country with a lot more people. So, of course, if they were to live at the exact same standard of living that we live, in the exact same energy use, of course they would have more emissions, but per capita, no. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention to total historic emissions, because that's what drives climate change, and per capita emissions, because that's where the real equity issues kick in.
Right. On all of these issues, and there are many more accumulating now, beyond what you've even covered in the book, but certainly climate change being the big one right now. But where can the public get reliable information? Is there a place? I'd like to point out, as you have done, the very persuasive websites and like I think it's Junk Science, something to look at to see how cleverly this is done to keep the public in the dark.
Right.
Well, if you wanted to get accurate information, where could you go?
Well, so this is a really important question, and to use a market metaphor, you have to be an informed consumer.
Yeah.
And what you can't do is you can't just go on the internet and Google climate change, because if you do that, you will get in your top 10 hits a number of climate change denial sites. And the same for acid rain, or if you were to type in sound science. And many of these groups are quite savvy and quite sophisticated about how they structure their websites, and they come up very high in your Google searches. So you have to search based on the source, not based on the topic. And I think the most reliable way for an ordinary person to deal with is to go to sources of scientific information. And so for climate change, my favorite website is the one that Eric helped build. And it was actually funny. I found this incredibly great website. It was just so clear at NASA. and has a whole layout about the evidence.
Yeah.
And I wrote to Eric, I said, by the way, are you aware of this website? He goes, yeah, I helped make it. I was like, oh, no wonder it's so good.
Right. And NOAA?
NOAA, exactly. The NASA one is particularly clear and particularly good about, what is the evidence? How do we know it's not volcanoes?
Yeah.
So I particularly like the NASA site, but NOAA is reliable. And on medical issues, CDC, Center for Disease Control, go to the CDC site and type in Ebola, but don't just type in Ebola into a Google search.
Oh my heavens, no, not now.
No. But the same is true for all these things. Don't just type in acid rain.
Right.
Go to the EPA, and in the EPA website, then search on acid rain within the EPA, and then you'll find good, high-quality scientific information. And most of these federal agencies have done a much better job in recent years of having web pages that are coherent and accessible to ordinary people.
Right.
I mean, there was a time when it was really hard for ordinary people to find scientific information in a format that they could understand.
Yes.
And that also opened the door for the disinformation, opened the door wide for disinformation.
Right.
I think that's improved in recent years, and I know that many of the federal agencies like NOAA, U.S. Geological Survey, EPA, CDC have become much more self-conscious about the need to present scientific information in plain language, simple vocabulary.
That is very good. That's very helpful. I was going to add that you have to be really careful about newspapers sometimes. It's unfortunate, but the opinion pages in certain newspapers in particular, but there is a difficulty. It is worth it after reading some of these columns to read the letters to the editor sometimes, where the scientists can protest if there is misinformation. I would like to ask also about the difference between this very deliberate misinforming of the public and a propaganda campaign as opposed to the normal doubts of scientists, which you did so beautifully in your book on the tectonic plates, which tell us that story if you would. It took so long for people to accept it and many other things.
Yeah, so one of the ironies of my situation is sometimes I get email from people who say, well, why should I believe scientists? Because look at plate tectonics, scientists didn't believe that. It's like, I know, I wrote the book on that.
Yes, you did. The book, I would say.
Literally the book, right? So my early work was about the history of plate tectonic theory, and I became interested in that for exactly this reason. I said, well, look, every historian of science knows that A, scientists argue, B, that dissent and disagreement is a real phenomenon, C, that sometimes it takes a long time for scientists to sort out what they think is the truth.
And get the evidence.
And D, sometimes they change their mind and decide that what they thought previously was wrong. So given that we know that, particularly as a member of the public who might be trying to make sense of all this stuff, how can we make sense of scientific information? And why should we believe what scientists tell us if we know that it sometimes can change? And so one of the things that I tried to do in the continental drift and plate tectonic story was just to sort of to give a description of how that history had played out and what was involved and what did it take for scientists to come to the point to be able to say, yes, we're convinced that this is true. And this is ultimately what I'm most interested in. So in a way, this book was sort of a weird, almost inversion of that. My interest has always been in when scientists say that we know something. How do they do that? What does it take for scientists to say that there's sufficient evidence of sufficient quality to say, yes, we believe this is true? And so in the plate tectonics book, or in the continental drift and plate tectonics work, I tracked that. And one of the things that I showed is that when the idea of continental drift was first proposed, scientists didn't accept it. And you might think that's a bad thing. You might say, well, look, see, this shows scientists are prejudiced, scientists are fallible, they were stupid, they were idiots, they were prejudiced, they rejected this idea, which we obviously now know is true. But actually, I don't think that's the correct interpretation. So why did scientists not accept this idea? Well, they have a big argument about evidence. And they have a big argument about how the evidence is interpreted. And they have a big argument about what the relationship is between evidence and theory and how you get from evidence to theory. And that is actually, I think, the strongest argument in defense of science, that scientists don't just jump on the bandwagon and just accept the first idea that comes across the transom. They actually have a rather high bar for accepting new ideas. And in the case of continental drift and plate tectonics, it took 40 years. Now, my own view is that some of that 40 years was the interruption of World War II. There was some very, very interesting work being done in the 1930s. And I actually believe now, I didn't say this in the book, but I believe this now, that if World War II had not intervened, I think earth scientists would have come to something like plate tectonics by the late 1930s or the early 40s. But that didn't happen. What happened was World War II intervened. The scientists who'd been working on the issue basically dropped it and went to work on other things. And after the war, it took a while before the issue could be sort of, the debate could be reopened. And it took new data, new evidence. But once they had that new evidence, actually the discussion got reopened rather quickly. And then within a rather short period of time, about 10 years, the scientific community said, oh yes, we think this is right. So what does this tell us? It tells us that scientists are intrinsically conservative, that they don't change their minds easily, that they have a high bar for new ideas, and the more radical the ideas, the bigger the consequences, the higher that bar is. So what that tells us is two things. First of all, that if scientists tell us that they have a consensus that something is true, chances are they did a lot of work to get there. And that work, that actual work of it, is probably the single biggest reason to believe it. And so then the question I think that's very important to ask is, well, how long have scientists been working on this, and how much work has there been? Because if an idea gets put forward that's only a couple of years old and there hasn't been much work behind it, then I think we actually should be suspicious. And one of the problems with the media is that often they run with some new idea that sounds exciting. Oh, we found the gene. We found the gene for cystic fibrosis. We'll have a cure next week.
Right.
But what the press don't do is to say, well, wait a second. You know, how stable is this claim? How much evidence is this really based on? Is this one study, or is it 100, or 1,000, or 10,000?
Yeah.
So it's really important to ask those kinds of questions. How much work? You know, how many papers, how many scientists, how long have they been working on this? How many different kinds of data? How many different groups? How many scientists in how many countries? So one of the things I like to say about climate science is, if you look at climate science, you see a couple of important things that the press almost never tell you. First of all, scientists have been working on this since the 1950s. Some people have heard of the Keeling curve, which is the chart that shows when does the Keeling curve start? Do you know?
I thought it was back then, actually, in the 50s.
1958.
Yes.
Dave Keeling began measuring carbon dioxide during the International Geophysical Year, 1957-58. This is more than 50 years old. It's very easy for me to actually remember how old the Keeling curve is because it's the same age as me. So we won't say exactly how many more years than 50, but more than 50 years. Half a century of data.
Right.
Second of all, climate change isn't just an observation that we're trying to make sense of. It's a prediction that came true. Scientists predicted in the 1950s that if CO2 increased, the climate would change. And it was because of that prediction that Dave Keeling, who was my colleague when I was in San Diego, started doing this work. It was to test whether or not that prediction would come true. So here we are more than 50 years later, and what's the answer? Yes, it's come true. And how do we know it's come true? Because we have so much data.
Right.
We have 150 years of instrumental data. We have 800,000 years of ice core data. We have scientists in over 100 countries who have published more than, I think the number now is something like 20,000 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals.
Right.
Does that mean that everything in the peer-reviewed journals is correct? No, of course not. Does that mean that scientists won't adjust what they think about some of the details in the future? Of course they will. Are there things about the climate system we still don't know? Absolutely. But is there an overall picture that's supported by a very large quantity and quality of diverse data and evidence? And have scientists been working on this for a long time? The answer to those questions is yes.
I'd like to point out, before we close, we have to stop so that people can talk to you a little bit in the audience, but that you are probably in the top rank of people who have analyzed models. So modeling for science is a very tricky business, and this is one of the experts in the world, so who's done endless work on this, and we do appreciate it. Thank you for telling us how to think scientifically. And I will now stop and let you talk to the audience. Thank you very much for joining us.
In the collapse of Western civilization, I think I sort of missed the idea that it's being written from somebody in China. So that's my bad. But the question is, you said that China actually is doing an awful lot in regard to not creating a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. But there's just a short period where they're going through an excessive amount, perhaps because of rapid development. Was that supposed to be just like a political thing because you're writing from there, or is that actually factually true?
The central argument of the book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, the new book with Eric Conway, is a question about why the liberal democracies failed to act on climate change and about the political and ideological obstacles. And the argument we were trying to make was that the merchants of doubt, the climate change deniers, argued that they're defending liberty. But we wanted to make the point that if you really care about liberty, you ought to be doing as much as possible to see that we act on climate change, because if we don't act on climate change, it could very well be that we end up seeing really terrible damaging effects, food riots, famine, disruptive weather events that will invite heavy-handed government intervention. And so the premise of the book is that actually when things go really bad, it's the authoritarian governments like China that are in a better position to mobilize troops, move people, commandeer the National Guard, all those sorts of things that happen when there are natural disasters. So it's not an argument in praise of China. It's not a pro-Chinese argument. It's an argument, it's meant to be a sort of, cautionary tale that if we don't do something soon, authoritarian regimes will be in a better position to deal with the consequence than liberal democracies. In terms of what's actually happening in China right now, I think it's a very mixed picture. I think the evidence of what's happening in China is kind of all of the above. On the one hand, we're seeing this very rapid industrialization, a lot of use of coal that's creating tremendous air pollution problems, staggeringly high rates of increases in greenhouse gases in the last 10 years. There's no denying that the industrial growth of China in the last 10 years has been incredible, and with it has been incredible increases in pollution, both greenhouse gases and other forms of pollutants. But at the same time, we also see that China is investing very, very heavily in renewables, solar, nuclear power. You can argue what you think about nuclear power. So it appears that what the Chinese are doing is a kind of all of the above strategy. They're using coal, but they're also developing renewables, and they're also developing nuclear. One has to hope that the Chinese government will begin to shift from the coal side of the equation to the renewables. And there's some evidence from this latest pact, this brand new USChina Pact, that may indeed be happening. But like any treaty, the proof is in the pudding. And I mean, the United States is committed to certain things under that treaty too. But whether or not we'll actually do those things, whether or not we'll be able to do those things, time will tell, and future historians will comment on it. Okay.
Well, you mentioned the treaty, and I'm curious, do you know some specifics about it? I've only seen that they shook hands and they agreed on it.
I know a few specifics, and it's on the subject of websites. The White House actually has a rather good website with the details, so if you go to whitehouse.gov, and there are some interesting specifics, including a major plan by the Chinese to invest in research and development on carbon capture and storage. And I think that's really telling, because carbon capture and storage is a potential technology that really many scientists think could make a big difference if it were shown to be technically feasible. And I think that Americans should be quite shocked that we're not leading the way on this and that we're actually yielding this territory to China. I mean, I find it shocking actually that Republicans are okay with that. Because if you think about America and American history and the history of technological leadership innovation, that seems like something that both Democrats and Republicans could get on board together about. I mean, I think almost all Americans think that technological innovation is by and large a good thing. And the idea that we would cede that ground to China and say, sorry, we're so busy arguing that we can't get our act together, but China, you do it. I mean, that actually seems to me rather shocking, and I'm surprised that sensible Republicans aren't more upset about that.
Just wondering if you had any insight as to whether in all these different industries, from tobacco right on through to fossil fuel and everything in between, do you think most of these guys who are writing the checks to these think tanks, do you think that they know that they're winning the battle but losing the war? In other words, that if they can just postpone for X number of quarters lower earnings per share, then that's their moral victory and they'll take it. And that at some number of quarters out or years out, I don't know what X is, they're going to have to throw in the towel, like the tobacco companies kind of did, but between now and then, make hay while the sun's shining?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And as I said, it's both and. It's both the ideology and the money is crucial for the spread of the ideology. It's crucial for the traction that it gets, the advertising, as you say, the faux white papers, the gray papers, But both are important because the ideology also explains the traction. Because, I've lectured all across the United States, and there are many people in the United States who don't, are not CEOs of a fossil fuel company and who don't even necessarily have shares in a fossil fuel company, but who still are really, not sure about climate science, sort of buy into the doubt mongering. And you ask yourself the question, well, why would that be? Why would this argument be persuasive to ordinary people who have no financial stake in ExxonMobil or Peabody Coal? And there I think the answer is in the ideology of personal liberty and the idea that this is a threat to your own individual liberty. So I think it's really important to understand both, because I think that without that, you can't really speak to those people who don't have financial interests in ExxonMobil or Peabody Coal. However, to answer the second part of your question, absolutely. I can't believe for a minute that the heads of these major corporations don't understand the science. I mean, if you think about a company like ExxonMobil or Chevron or Shell, these companies have thousands of scientists working for them, including thousands of geoscientists. This may seem like a cliche, but some of my best friends worked for Chevron. Right? When I was at Stanford, my office mate had worked for Chevron, one of my favorite professors. I actually have a lot of friends in the oil and gas industry. My former college boyfriend worked for British Gas. So I don't believe for a minute that the heads of these corporations don't understand the science. But I think there's two things that are going on. I think one of them is that at the very highest level, there is this kind of profound cynicism, which is the cynicism of delay. Yes, we know that sooner or later there's going to be a price on carbon. The CEO of Shell pretty much said that just recently, and the CEO of ExxonMobil has kind of implied it. We just don't think it's going to happen right away. We think that oil and gas remain good investments for the foreseeable future, and therefore, it makes sense for us to continue to invest in oil and gas. So I think there is a strategy of delay. There's a strategy of the longer we can put off the price on carbon or whatever the regulatory structure is, the better it is for us and our shareholders, right? And that's totally what the tobacco industry did. It's also what we know certain pharmaceutical companies did when they had evidence that certain drugs were, hurting people, right? So we know that happens. But there's also this level down from that, a notch or two down, which is, say, people who work for these companies but aren't necessarily the CEOs and vice presidents. And there I think there's a lot of rationalization. And we have a lot of evidence from the history of tobacco. There were a lot of people who worked for the tobacco industry who did not know what the CEOs knew. The CEOs knew that their own scientists were telling them that tobacco was killing people. The CEOs knew that their own scientists were telling them there's no such thing as a safe cigarette. And the CEOs knew that their own scientists were telling them that nicotine was addictive. But there were lots of people who worked for those companies who didn't know that, because all of that information was hidden from their own sales forces. And in fact, one of the most telling documents that I looked at was a document that basically said, we can't let our salespeople know this, because if we did, they'd get demoralized and they might even think that the time had come to find a different job. So there was a kind of an internal disinformation campaign that took place of trying to persuade the rank and file inside these companies that the science was unsettled, we didn't really know. And I think the evidence suggests that those internal campaigns were quite effective. And so there are many people who work in the oil and gas industry today, who work in coal, and sometimes I meet them on airplanes, who really do think that the science is unsettled. And they've bought into that argument because it's been what they've been told and because it makes it possible for them to continue to do the work that they do.
Looking at the media side of the picture, same thing, right? You gotta believe that there's a lot of smart people in the media, and they know that this fair, the balance, supposed balance of having two sides represented as if they have equivalent evidence or whatever, they know that that's not really what's going on, or at least a lot of them. So you seeing any movement or cracks there to,
Oh, I think there's been a lot of movement in the mass media. I think that actually the mass media coverage of climate has changed a lot just in the last year or so. And I think the evidence for that, if you look at how major newspapers covered the synthesis report, the IPC synthesis report that just came out, it's quite different than how they were covering it even 2, 3, 4 years ago, even different from how they covered the fifth assessment report. Even some cases different even like from how they covered even a few months ago. So I definitely think there's been a shift in the media landscape. But at the same time, and at the risk of offending friends in the media, I have to say I've been shocked by what journalists don't know about science. And maybe I shouldn't be shocked because, of course, they're journalists, they haven't studied it. But it is incredible to me how many journalists have said things like, well, isn't it appropriate just to give both sides? And I say, but there aren't both sides. There aren't two sides. If there were two sides, if there was an actual debate in the scientific community, that would be two sides. But that's not what's happening here. And it's amazing to me how many journalists have been sort of, it's kind of a stunned silence when I say that. And I think a lot of journalists really don't know anything about how science operates. And I think a lot of journalists have been actually quite naive. I mean, we had journalists who read this book and initially wanted to argue with us about it. But then when they read the book and they, looked at the documents and they realized, I think that was an awkward moment for some journalists because no journalist wants to admit that he's been snookered or she's been snookered. But I think that to some extent, some journalists were. Now, there's another part of this. This book is not about journalism. It's about the scientists and the way in which science can be misrepresented. But we talk about journalism a little bit in the end. And Stan Glantz, who did some of the most important work on the history of the tobacco industry and tobacco disinformation, he said he thought that we were way too soft on not so much the journalists writing the stories, but the editors and the publishers, because he thinks that, at least in the case of tobacco, the weight and the power of tobacco advertising was sufficiently great that this played a major role in the editorial decisions of editors and publishers. And that may well be true. We didn't really research that, so we don't really have the evidence to make a judgment one way or the other. It's certainly plausible. And when you think about the advertising, that we see, I mean, for how many years did the New York Times publish, on that op-ed page, big advertisements from ExxonMobil telling us we didn't really know whether the climate science was settled? The idea that maybe had some influence doesn't seem to be completely implausible. Thank you.